Hi, this is Lili Sanderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. Thank you for joining me this week. I am catching up a little bit from last week. I got excited about the dedicatory prayer for the Kirtland Temple and kind of missed that there was another section to last week's reading. So we will talk a little bit about section 110 as well as this week's curriculum, 111 through 114. First, I want to just express my gratitude for the life and mission of President Nelson. I'm so grateful that he was our prophet these past 8-ish years, lived a remarkable life in many, many ways, as all these amazing men who are our prophets, seers, and revelators on the earth have done. We'll remember him for lots of wonderful messages. Certainly the encouragement to go to the temple, to have the fullness of the Spirit, which is sanctification, to be peacemakers, to have daily repentance, to prepare for the second coming. He had so many ways of saying that the time is near, and I hope we've heard that. When our family gathers, not every time, but sometimes somebody will toss out, all right, what's over under on the coming of the Lord? And it's interesting to hear where people's feelings are. All of us tend to be on the shorter side. Most of us tend to be thinking that the time is coming relatively soon, but, we don't know. And it's not that the date and the time matters so much as I think that sacred urgency that Hugh Nibley talked about on occasion, that we could become prepared and become a Zion people, which again, President Nelson did talk about, that we could be the people who would be prepared to meet the Lord. Now, I also have to mention so many things happening in the world today, and many of them tragic. Last time I spent some time on some really sweet moments that I've become aware of, that, really good people doing good things, young people doing wonderful things. But there was another tragedy that directly impacts the church in Flint, Michigan, as someone drove a car into the chapel and then set fire to the building, which looks like it was a terrible conflagration and pretty much destroyed the building. And then, of course, opened fire on the congregants. And this is just the Monday night following those tragic events yesterday. So, of course, stories get updated. But I did try to check an update just before coming in to record, and the most recent update said that there were 4 of the congregation who had been killed, not counting the perpetrator, and that there were 8 wounded. And there was no report on, how serious or critical their conditions may be. I certainly hope that they'll recover if they can, and ask God's blessings of comfort and peace to be on all who were there and all involved, and all the families and friends and neighbors of those who were injured or killed. And we've talked about this, how hatred has grown, that hatred has been expressed so readily. Social media seems to have given a space. While good things can be done on social media, and we do see that sometimes, and that's wonderful, but we see that the anonymity of social media, or at least, the distance between the speaker and the audience, can lead people to say things that hopefully, and in the past, we used to think that they would never say those things directly to anybody else, certainly not in a public way, but social media has given license to that. And I did hear someone talking the other day about sort of our permission culture, and I've mentioned that before, that there are some voices in our world and society that are acting like if you're able to make a case for being a minority or a group that's oppressed, or a race or a sex that's oppressed, that it justifies somehow any action that you take against the perceived oppressor. So again, we can see this neo-Marxist idea of oppressed versus oppressors creating so much evil and destruction in the world and in our very neighborhoods. So a tragic situation there. I saw just a little snippet on YouTube again before coming in here to record that didn't have a caption that told us who the speaker was. So I apologize for not knowing, but he was in a uniform and obviously an official, and there was a seal on the podium for that jurisdiction or county where Flint, Michigan is. And he was giving a bit of an update. So he gave a few updated facts and then said, and this was really nice. It didn't sound like he was a member of our church necessarily, but he did say that he wanted to thank all the first responders. And then he made a special point of saying, I also want to point out and show appreciation for the courage of the congregants. He said there were many children there, and the congregants had taken immediate action to protect the children. Anyway, it was interesting. I wonder exactly what he saw or what was reported to him that he would make mention of that specifically, but it was a sweet tribute to the courage of the people who were involved in that terrible tragedy. And other things that I've heard a little bit on media, but also anecdotally, is that there have been really sweet shows of love and kindness made to the church in general. Like somebody was reporting that flowers had been brought to their chapel, which wasn't in Michigan, but just that some kind people who wanted to show support to the members of our church brought flowers and put them close to a chapel, or brought them to the bishop's house or whatever. Anyway, lots of little things like that that have been really sweet and kind. So nice to see that again, in the midst of tragedy, that there are acts of goodness. May we be a part of that always, and try to encourage and strengthen those who are in and out of our church membership, but be good brothers and sisters to the world, especially at these times of grief and trouble. Last week, I did mention that verse and I used it as the title for the podcast, and we just repeat it. That phrase from section 109, which was the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. This is verse 38 at the end. Well, let me read more of it. Prepare the hearts of thy saints for all those judgments thou art about to send in thy wrath upon the inhabitants of the earth. So think how relevant this is to us today. Prepare the hearts of thy saints for all those judgments thou art about to send in thy wrath upon the inhabitants of the earth because of their transgressions, that thy people may not faint in the day of trouble. That thy people may not faint in the day of trouble. Again, may we hold that close to us forever, and whatever our troubles are, whatever our losses. Again, let me thank all of those of you who message me either through YouTube as comments or from the website and send in messages to my inbox. I don't get to answer all of them. I want to, and I try to go back sometimes and catch up a little bit. It's not going to be a perfect task. I won't get to all of them, but brothers and sisters, I read all of them, and I'm touched by what you share, and I know that many of you are carrying really heavy burdens, past, present. We can't really compare crosses, but brothers and sisters, I really do see that people who are trying to follow covenant path and do what's right are not spared the chastening and the tribulations and the refining troubles of the world. And I hope we don't get stuck in that forgive me, I don't mean to sound horribly harsh on this, but sort of that remedial question, why do bad things happen to good people? I think, we have so much evidence as to how that works into the plan. Not that God ever authorizes evil things to happen. He does not inspire evil. He does not work against the goodness that is in him and the love that he has for each of us that is beyond what we can even understand at this stage of our existence. He doesn't work against that. He's not divided against himself or his purposes, but in his perfect plan and with his incredible engineering, he has, and we talked about this just a few weeks ago, he has created this trajectory of progress that gives us the potential to become like him. And again, consider the distance between where we are and where God is. We don't see it like Moses saw it in Moses chapter 1, but Moses saw it. And his response was, wow. I mean, he's passed out for several hours. And then he says, wow, for this cause I know that man is nothing, which thing I had never before supposed. So he is so startled that that's the first thing he says when he comes to. I had no idea how much distance there was between me and God, and each of us and God. So if he is giving us a chance to be brought to his stature, the stature of his son, and then eventually, God's ourselves, brothers and sisters, it's not going to happen without a lot of stretching, without a lot of refinement, without a lot of trouble that can give us the opportunity to choose him in the midst of our pain, to choose him and allow our faith in Jesus Christ to be strengthened and our trust in the Father and in his plan and in his timing to be polished and become bright and perfect. Ultimately, our faith can be perfected. So there are going to be troubles. And it also allows the wicked to have their day of agency so that there will be witnesses to condemn them. Not that we desire the condemnation or the bad outcomes for the wicked. I mean, again and again, God tells us, don't delight in that. We need to see the worth of a soul and recognize that everybody could be better if they chose, and that would be a wonderful thing. But also to not complain against the justice of the universe and the justice of God, which decrees that unrepented sins will have to be reconciled through the suffering for sin that will happen in hell after this life, hell being temporary, and then they'll be redeemed into a kingdom of glory, most likely the Tileshma if they were rebellious, of course. Okay, another bit of business that I need to take care of. Got a couple of questions on this, and I actually forgot to make a note about it, but it flashed into my head, so let's take care of it right now. Some of you asked about Adam and Eve having other children that did not accept the gospel. So let's just turn to that. That's Moses 5. A lot of information in the Pearl of Great Price that we don't get in other places that is fascinating and kind of fleshes out some really important points. Okay, so let's look at Moses 5, right early in the chapter. It talks about, they have been driven out of the Garden of Eden and they labor. And verse 2, so this is Moses 5, verse 2. Adam knew his wife, and she bare unto him sons and daughters, lots of sons and daughters. And they began to multiply and to replenish the earth. So they're growing up and pairing off and multiplying. They're spreading out on the earth. Verse 3, and from that time forth, the sons and daughters of Adam began to divide two and two in the land, just said that, and to till the land and tend the flocks, and also begat sons and daughters. Verse 4, Adam and Eve, his wife, called upon the name of the Lord, and they had heard the voice of the Lord from the way toward the Garden of Eden, speaking unto them. And he gave unto them commandments, verse 5. And so they're told to do the offerings with the firstlings of the flock. and they're obedient. And then the angel comes and asks them whatever. I'm going to skip a little while because that's a different point. And then after they have received further instructions, I mean, think about it. They were offering those sacrifices, it looks like, for years. It doesn't specify exactly, but it could have been decades that they were offering that sacrifice. And then the angel comes and says, why are you doing this? I don't know. I said, the Lord has commanded us. So, which is a pretty good reason, by the way, because God does ask for a trial of our faith sometimes, so he doesn't give us the answer right away. So who knows how long they were offering sacrifice, but it was a while at least. And then they talk about like, wow, we understand better because Christ is going to come in the meridian of time, and this is going to give us a chance to be saved and completely reconciled with God. But now, because of the use of our agency and coming to mortality and getting mortal body and having children, all these things are really gracious and they're huge blessings to us. So she's getting the bigger picture, and Adam with her, of course. And they bless the name of God, verse 12. And here it is, end of verse 12. They made all things known unto their sons and their daughters, which is naturally what you would do. We finally understand another key element of the plan, that Christ will come. And if we are obedient and we repent, and we can be completely reconciled with God, but in a glorified state because we have passed through mortality and had a chance to exercise agency, receive a body, etc. And verse 13, immediately you want to tell your children, right? Like, oh, here's the good news. And Satan came among them, saying, I am also a son of God. And he commanded them, saying, believe it not. And they believed it not. Now, clearly, that's not talking about Adam and Eve. It's talking about their sons and daughters who had already paired off and were multiplying and replenished throughout the land. And they loved Satan more than God. Well, there it is. And men began from that time forth to be carnal, sensual, and devilish. And God calls on them to repent and whatever. And then we get some detail about Cain's offering. So let's look a little bit at that too, because that was the other question. How do we know that he offered vegetables is the way I put it. But let's look at this. The end of verse 17, we have Abel and Cain that are born. And as they grow up, Abel is a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And then here's the really critical part of the story, verse 18, Cain loved Satan more than God. So, it's not just a matter of like he worthily offered his sacrifice and it just wasn't accepted, and so then he became bitter. No, he chose Satan over God. He's taught by his parents, and he chooses to follow Satan. So then, the end of verse 18, Satan commanded him, saying, make an offering unto the Lord. So he's even bringing his offering because Satan tells him to do it. So he's not doing this to be righteous and make an appropriate offering to God. Satan is saying do it. And what does he tell him? Look at this. In process of time, verse 19, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. There it is. Maybe there was fruit in there too, but it's vegetables. It's anyway, something he can grow. It's grain or whatever. And his parents taught him, because we had that whole story just the page before about the angel coming and say, why do you offer this sheep, the firstlings of the flock? And then the angel tells him, it's in similitude of the Lamb of God that will come, the Lamb without spot. This is a type of the offering that God will make to the earth, and that Christ will give himself a sacrifice so that we can be saved. And Satan inspires Cain to do an offering of his own stuff. This has been talked about by scholars for a long time. It's suggested that part of it was that this was playing on his pride. To get a lamb, what would he need to do? He would need to go to his brother Abel and say, can I get a lamb from you to offer to the Lord? And maybe because they're grown men or whatever, he would have had to make some sort of exchange with him. Hey, I'll bring you food or that I'm tilling or whatever, the products of my labor. And if I can share that with you, if you can give me a firstling, a lamb without spot that I can offer to the Lord in righteousness. It certainly would have been available to him. But that's not what happens. Satan inspires him to make an offering, and he tells him to make it of the fruits of his own labor, which are, like I said, fruits or vegetables or grains. something that he's growing, which he knows darn good and well is a sacrilegious offering. And there's no question he's doing this because Satan is telling him to do it. So a little more detail to that story that I mentioned last time. And then, Abel brings the right sacrifice, and God has respect unto Abel, but unto Cain and his offering he had not respect. Well, of course not, because Cain is being blasphemous and willfully sacrilegious. He's doing it because Satan told him to do it, and he does it in this really sacrilegious way. And Satan knows this. This is verse 21, and it pleased him. He wants to create that enmity and to, sift Cain as wheat. And Cain was wroth, and his countenance fell. Now, talk about, petty. I mean, he does this because Satan tells him to, and he gives a sacrilegious offering, knowing very well what he's doing. And then when Abel's offering is accepted and his isn't, now he's upset. He's got this big chip on his shoulder. Again, well, you didn't take my offering, even though I know it was completely blasphemous. And so just to finish off this part of the story, I love this. I actually use this with my kids sometimes. Hopefully I didn't, sound too nasty about it. It wasn't my intent, but I just thought this is so clear here. And I love the way the Lord talks to Cain. Verse 22, the Lord says unto Cain, why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? Verse 23, if thou doest well, thou shalt be accepted. I mean, it's kind of like plain as the nose on your face, not rocket science. Like, are you kidding? Like, the Lord will receive us if we come humbly in the way that he has designated, if we're obedient. But Cain does it in exactly the wrong ways, and then he's upset about it. And the Lord says, seriously? Seriously, you're upset about this? If thou doest well, thou shalt be accepted. It's not complicated, Cain. I'm not playing favorites. I don't like your brother better than you to begin with, but I can't respect your offering if you're doing it in sacrilege and blasphemy. Anyway, I love that line, if thou doest well, thou shalt be accepted. God really is no respecter of persons, but he does have respect unto sacrifices and obedience that are made in righteousness and with the desire to obey and to please the Lord. And he's not going to respect our offerings if they're cheap or blasphemous or sacrilegious, or they're, some sort of bargain we're trying to strike. I want you to take this, not this, Anyway, okay, so that's a clarification for what I mentioned last week about why it's tender to me that when Seth is born, after Cain, who's already chosen Satan over God, kills his brother Abel, who was righteous, and how heartbreaking that must have been for Adam and Eve, because finally, after having all those other children, they have two sons who look like they're going to be obedient, and Abel was. Cain isn't, and ends up killing his righteous brother. Anyway, what a comfort that they had this son, Seth, who looked exactly like his father and could only be distinguished from him by age. So I think that's a tender story that we discussed last time, and this is the rest of the background to that for those of you who were wondering. It's right there in Moses 5. Okay, let's talk about section 110 just briefly, and I am going to be pretty brief on these sections here. There's a couple of things we're going to mention. Section 110, this is really important, and I apologize that I didn't mention it last week, especially for those of you who have lessons. But can I just say, even if you taught a lesson on this last week, you can teach about 110 if you want to add this to it the next week. That's the wonderful thing about being a teacher. As long as it's just not a one and done assignment, but you're going to teach another class, you can always go back and say, like, let's just revisit this, which I certainly have done my whole teaching career, because things occur to me after the fact, or sometimes I forget to include something. Here we are, section 110. So what's going on here? This is just a few days after the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, and something magnificent happens, where there's a visitation by these heavenly beings to transfer keys. Let's see. In the heading, the occasion was that of a Sabbath day meeting. The prophet prefaces his record with these words, in the afternoon, I assisted the other presidents in distributing the Lord's Supper to the church, receiving it from the 12. After having performed this service, I retired to the pulpit, the veils being dropped, bowed myself with Oliver Cowdery in solemn and silent prayer. After rising from prayer, the following vision was opened to both of us. So they have this amazing vision where Moses and Elias appear and commit their keys, and then Elijah returns and commits his keys. This is a fulfillment of lots of prophecies that talk about the coming of these prophets in the last days in order to turn the hearts of, well, in Elijah's case, turn the hearts of the children of the parents and the parents of the children, etc. And that's all about sealing keys and family history work and temple work, right? But this is the point I want to make. I want to make 2 points about Section 110. Number one, and I've talked about these things before, but I'm going to talk about them again, that God is so precise. He is a God of order, and he has a way of doing things. And it's a testimony that he is consistent to what he has said and how he does things, and then he does them in the next dispensation and the next, and whenever it's prophesied, right? And I hope that we feel that added layer of testimony and trust and belief as we see how God he just doesn't drop balls. I drop lots of balls, but God just doesn't drop any balls. Every jot and tittle is fulfilled. So I'm talking specifically about the fact that keys are transferred, priesthood keys are transferred by the laying on of hands, right? That's how it has always been done, and that's how it will always be done. Now, we're talking about people who had these keys last, and okay, that'll be in part 2 here, but they had to lay their hands on the heads of Joseph Smith. And I don't know, did he lay them on Oliver Cowdery too? But anyway, at least Joseph Smith receives these keys. They had to have hands. How do they have hands? Well, and I mentioned this in the New Testament years because now they could be resurrected. But when they transferred these keys to Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration, the resurrection had not yet commenced, right? Jesus Christ being the first fruits of them that slept. So Christ was still alive when the Mount of Transfiguration happens. So how do you get the transfer of keys from Moses, who has died, but the resurrection has not begun? Well, remember, Moses is not buried. He goes into the wilderness at the end of his life, at the end of his ministry. Remember, God doesn't let him enter the promised land. And they say nobody knows where he's buried. Well, because he wasn't buried. He was translated. Why? Because translated beings still have physical bodies. If he had died, he would have had a spirit body, but he wouldn't have been able to lay physical hands on the heads of Peter, James, and John. The same thing is true of Elias and Elijah. Elijah is depicted in lots of artwork throughout, art museums in the world. Maybe you've seen some of those, going off in a fiery chariot, because that's what it says in the Old Testament, that Elijah went into the heavens in a fiery chariot. He was translated. He still had his body. He still had his hands. We don't have the details about Elias, and Elias is a little bit trickier of a case because Elias is both the name of an Old Testament prophet, but it's also a title. So John the Baptist has been referred to as an Elias. Christ himself has been referred to as an Elias, and others as well. So there's a little bit of mushiness about exactly who that person is who has the keys, but I'm not going to let it bother me. He had the keys to the Gospel of Abraham. That's what it is. Sorry, let me get this right. I have to pay attention. Moses restores the keys of the gathering of Israel. In verse 11, 12, Elias appeared and committed the dispensation of the Gospel of Abraham. And then, of course, Elijah comes with the sealing keys as prophesied by Malachi. So this was one of those wonderful moments that you get when you teach sometimes. It was one of our awards in Las Vegas. I think it was probably Desert View Award or It might have been the 30th ward, whatever, one of our early wards in Las Vegas. And I was teaching gospel doctrine, and I was writing this on the board for the class just to keep it straight. Here are the prophets that came to the Kirtland Temple, same ones that came to the Mount of Transfiguration, and here are the keys that they brought back. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at those, and it clicked. And I thought, oh my goodness, again, the Lord is so orderly. This is the second point I want to make. I could see it. As many of us grew up hearing that, of course, the mission of the church is to bring people to Christ, to come into Christ ourselves and help to bring people to Christ in three ways: the preaching of the gospel, the perfecting of the saints, and the redeeming of our dead. And I saw those. As I looked at the keys, I thought, that's what those are. Again, the Lord is so precise and so consistent. His course is one eternal round, but he doesn't deviate from that which he has said, because the gathering of Israel is the preaching of the gospel. That's missionary work. The gospel of Abraham is to perfect the saints. If we live the gospel, that is the covenant path toward becoming complete, which will be a gift that is given in the right time and way if we are diligent in seeking it. And the sealing powers are the redeeming of our dead. So there it was, those three ways that we bring people to Christ and come to Christ ourselves. Anyway, I love how tidy it is. I love it. I love that if keys have to be transferred, people have to have hands. Men have to have hands. The ones who had the keys, give it to the ones who are going to get them. And they have to have hands. And that was more relevant on the Mount of Transfiguration, but those same men come now. They may have been resurrected, probably were after the resurrection of Christ. But if they had not been, God would have made an allowance for that. And he would have made sure they have hands, which he did for Peter, James, and John. Anyway, I think that's beautiful. And then we have that consistency of message. These are the three ways that we come to Christ and bring others to Christ: the gathering of Israel, which is the preaching of the gospel of Abraham, which is the perfecting of the saints, or in other words, that covenant path, that seeking of the Lord, that hungering and thirsting after righteousness, desiring sanctification. That is the gospel of Abraham. And then the redeeming of our dead, of course, which requires the sealing keys. So the Lord's consistent. The Lord is consistent. Again, we can take it to the bank. We can trust it. I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end if we have a moment left. But okay, some nice statements. I do want to mention one thing from section 112. I will mention, too, that, again, as I mentioned last time, we're going to see a little bit more spread out sections here, because now in just these few pages, we go from the Kirtland Temple dedication, the visitation of these prophets with keys, and the transfer of those keys to Joseph Smith. But we also then, by the time we get to section 114, which, as I said, is just a couple of pages further, we're into April 1838, which is 2 years after the dedication of the temple in Kirtland. So just a few sections cover 2 years. And as you know, when the church was just being organized, there were really a lot of sections, one after another, contributing to the organization and the structure and the instruction that Joseph Smith needed in order to get things going and to answer problems and questions that came up. But now they are doing a lot of the work that has already been revealed to them, and they're not recording as many for the Book of Commandments. Joseph Smith is still getting revelations, but as far as the ones that he is instructed to include in what eventually becomes the Doctrine and Covenants, they're more spread out and not as frequent. So I think that's just something to note, because the time is passing fairly quickly here. By the time we get to section 114, the church is 8 years old since its formal organization in the last days. I'm not going to talk too much about the instruction giver, the 12 and so on. Thomas Marsh had some issues with pride. He got pretty upset because Joseph Smith had called, I think it was Heber C. Kimball and Parley Pratt, on a mission and hadn't run it past Thomas Marsh, who is the president of the 12. And Thomas Marsh felt like that was his stewardship and jurisdiction. And, he has to be kind of called down or called out about that, telling him in verse 15 of section 112, "Exalt not yourselves, rebel not against my servant Joseph." So there's some rebellion in the ranks. Of course, a very well-known verse here in section 112, "Be thou humble, and the Lord thy God shall lead thee by the hand." This is verse 10 of section 112. "And give thee answer to thy prayers." We hear that one quoted a lot. It's a lovely summary statement. I guess I will also go back one more section for a minute and just mention a couple of verses in section 111. "Concern not yourselves about your debts." This is verse 5 and verse 6. "For I will give you power to pay them. Concern not yourselves about Zion, for I will deal mercifully with her." Now, I just want to point out that God gives us those messages of counsel and comfort not because the problem is going to be solved right away, but because he wants us to trust that eventually those promises will be kept. And that in the meantime, when we received a promise, but we haven't had its fulfillment yet, that there is growth for us to accomplish. There are things for us to learn, that our faith can be deepened and strengthened. We can choose to believe what we cannot see. So the church is not immediately, or even in the next little while, taken care of financially in ways that they might have hoped. And during this time, we have a disaster with the Kirtland Safe Society. Joseph Smith is concerned about the finances of the church, and they're trying to get a bank set up for the growing community, but they can't get permission from the state of Illinois, so they do something which isn't really a bank, but kind of like a bank, and it's sort of a business that where the saints own shares, so that it's like they're all stockholders, and he and his family had purchased a large number of those shares. And then, there's the panic of 1837 in the United States, and some banks are closed and so on, and the Kirtland Safe Society is not looking good. A lot of people withdraw their money because of the troubles and how they were running short. Joseph and his family didn't get any of their money out, so they lost whatever they had invested as a family. And others lost money too, so that created a big problem. And as we have seen time and time again, after great blessings, such as the dedication of the Kirtland Temple and the heavenly manifestations that happen in and around that event, as well as in Kirtland in general, because a lot of amazing things. I mentioned hearing that fireside with my friend Karen that was given by Mr. Kirtland, is his nickname, Brother Anderson, who maybe knows more about Kirtland than anybody else and has written about it. Anyway, just all the times that the Father and the Son appeared in Kirtland, like really extraordinary things happen. And so what else happens? Well, Satan tries to snuff out the light. So we end up with a time of great trouble in Kirtland as well. A lot of apostasy. And again, I hope we kind of reflect on our own lives and realize that that happens. That happens when the potential for growth and development are there, that a lot of times trouble comes as well to, again, chasten and try us and give us an opportunity to overcome through faith and to not faint in the day of trouble. That verse is going to resonate for me for a long time, and I hope for the rest of my life, because I think that's really necessary for all of us. I did want to point out something else from section 112. This is something I've quoted as a counselor again and again and again. I've said this before, but when we first knew that Chris was going to be transferred to Salt Lake from Las Vegas, we didn't really want to come. We were very happy in Las Vegas and thought we would stay. And anyway, we were surprised when he got it was sort of an invitation. I guess he wouldn't have had to take it, but it was one of those questions you're not really supposed to say no to, because he was the director of family services in Nevada, and they wanted him to come up and be the director of the Salt Lake office, which is their biggest office, of course, right downtown, and kind of the flagship agency of the family services. And we didn't really want to come, but we came up and talked to them and prayed about it, and both of us felt like we should. And it was sort of disappointing and not exciting, because we were happy where we were. One of the things I said to Chris, because my practice had just been starting to grow, pretty fast. I was just finishing my full licensure as an LCSW, licensed clinical social worker, and just finished that up shortly before we left Las Vegas. I was already practicing under supervision, but I was getting a lot of clients, and it just seemed like this was gonna be a blessing for our family, and I really enjoyed what I was doing and felt like I was doing good. And coming to Utah, I remember thinking like, "Well, why would they need another LDS counselor in Utah? There there are gonna be plenty of Latter-day Saint counselors in Utah." So I kind of thought, well, it probably, won't be needed. And that didn't ever seem to happen the way I thought it would. I did get a revelation that I should start the PhD program, as I've mentioned before, and I started just 2 weeks after we moved here, so it was pretty rapid fire, and we were building a new house and everything, so it was a very busy time, but I also got clients right away. There's a lot of people in Vegas know people in Utah, and I started getting calls almost immediately saying like, "Is this the Lily Anderson who did counseling in Las Vegas? Can I come and see you?" So I was surprised by that, and we had to, anyway, adapt our plans at home so that we could put in a home office with its own entrance, so it would be private and have a tiny little waiting room and a serviceable office in the basement that I could use to see clients, and I'm so glad and grateful that we were moved to do that because I spent a lot of years of my life in that office over the next decades anyway. I still was doing the PhD, and I taught at BYU for several years, so those were really busy times, but I remember then talking to Chris about this and say like, "Well, maybe they did need another Latter-day Saint counselor in Utah," because what I saw was that a big part of the privilege that I had as a counselor was to help people rescue their testimonies from things that had happened to them as church members, maybe because of other members, sometimes because of other leaders, sometimes because of church policies or whatever that they didn't quite understand or couldn't reconcile with their own experience or that somehow had been painful. And it was really a great privilege to be brought into people's lives in that arena. Not everybody came in for that purpose, but it was surprising to me how many people did. And I suppose that always happens when there are a lot of members. Anyway, this was a verse that I used with a lot of those people. Okay, that was a long warm up. Sorry about that. But here's the punchline. I would go to a section 112 sometimes. Verse 23, let's start with that. "Verily, verily, I say unto you, darkness covereth the earth, and gross darkness the minds of the people. And all flesh has been corrupt before my face." Well, Lord, tell us what you really think. Darkness covereth the earth, and gross darkness the minds of the people. That is too often the case. All flesh has become corrupt before my face. Verse 24, "Behold," and then I'm going to also read 25, 26, 27, and 28, okay? So these will be the next few verses. "Behold, vengeance cometh speedily upon the inhabitants of the earth, a day of wrath, burning, desolation, of weeping, of mourning, and of lamentation. And as a whirlwind it shall come upon all the face of the earth, saith the Lord." Okay, familiar ideas, right? That there will be the destruction of the wicked that will come. And it will come during days of tribulation, but also, of course, when the Lord comes, it will finish up, right? And that's, pretty vivid description. A day of wrath, of burning, desolation, weeping, mourning, of lamentation. As a whirlwind it shall come upon all the face of the earth, saith the Lord. And upon my house shall it begin. And from my house shall it go forth, saith the Lord. First among those among you, saith the Lord, who have professed to know my name and have not known me, and have blasphemed against me in the midst of my house, saith the Lord. Therefore see to it that ye trouble not yourselves concerning the affairs of my church in this place, saith the Lord, but purify your hearts before me, and then go ye into all the world and preach my gospel unto every creature who has not received it. Okay, now let's go back and take a little closer look at this. Upon my house shall it begin. When God is talking about the destruction of the wicked, he says it's going to start with his church. Now, why was I quoting this to people who had been hurt by the church? Because this gave them comfort that the Lord was very mindful of things that are not right in the earthly kingdom of God, in the temporal organization of the church. Again, we've talked about this so often, that the wheat and the tares grow together, and the Lord has warned us about that from forever. We shouldn't be surprised by it, and yet sometimes we still get bent out of shape. And, not to say that hurt and injury isn't real and that it isn't unfortunate, because it is unfortunate and it is real, but it's going to happen. And we've talked about that. Why do bad things happen to good people? Because the bad people then will have witnesses against the fact that they actually did follow through on their wicked desires. And there were people who can testify of that, or the blood of the innocent, or, the blood of the prophets, whatever, will testify. So they will have a chance to use their agency. And yes, that means sometimes they're going to be allowed to be injurious or unjust, painful and hurtful to those around them. And the other thing is that it gives the saints the chance, because of the unrighteous use of agency on the parts of some of our brethren and sisters, that we can use our agency to overcome through faith, and to not let that stand between us and the saving ordinances, or our testimonies, or our activity, or involvement in the Lord's kingdom. That we can see the longer trajectory of the plan and realize that, both of these things are necessary. So I'm not going to get bent out of shape over it. And I am going to recognize that God is telling me, hold those thoughts, because it will happen when I come. And when it is a day of wrath and burning and desolation and lamentation, etc., it'll start in my church. So I know there are things that are not happening the way they should. And it was that gave a lot of comfort to people who have been hurt and have wondered why the Lord hasn't cleaned house yet. Because he says he's going to wait and do it at the end. And the wheat and the tares will grow together, because our faith is weak. And it gives people a chance to mature and to be refined and to look past the immediate to the promises that God has made concerning mercy not being able to rob justice, and a day of judgment that will happen, and a day of accountability. And then to recognize that all I can do is try to tend my own garden and be ready for that day of judgment myself, so that I can participate in the great part of the great and dreadful day, and not the dreadful part of the great and dreadful day. Okay, let's just look at this again. Upon my house shall begin, and from my house shall it go forth. Now, another reason for that, in my mind, is that God's not a hypocrite. Because if he went and cleaned up the world of all the wicked when he came, before cleaning up the church, you can imagine some of those scoundrels out there would look at him and go well, what about those sons of guns in your own church? There's some people in your own church that aren't behaving well, or, they're hypocrites or whatever. And God will never put himself in that position, because he's not a hypocrite. So he's going to clean house first, and then he'll go out and get the rest of those scoundrels out there. That's just how it's going to be, and it makes perfect sense. So it should be, again, very comforting and reassuring that this has always been the plan. It's not a surprise to the Lord that there are things that are going wrong in the church, in the temporal kingdom. That doesn't mean he's going to let the church as a whole go astray. And in my opinion, it doesn't mean, just like these early leaders, that even though people aren't perfect, Joseph Smith wasn't perfect, but that doesn't mean he wasn't a prophet. And that doesn't mean that he wasn't guiding the church according to the desires of the Lord. And that when he was, getting a little off, that the Lord corrected him, so that the church could be blessed as we sustain the prophets. And here we are. We're going to sustain a new prophet just this coming weekend. And it will be Dallin Oaks, because that is the order of the kingdom. Actually, and that's very exciting. I'm very excited about it. I love Dallin Oaks. And I've been a big fan since he was a president of BYU. So I'm thrilled. And I've had an opportunity to meet his sweet wife. I knew his first wife, June, actually, is my visiting teacher shortly after we were married. Loved her dearly. And then I've met his wife now, Kristen, And she's a wonderful person, and I love her dearly, and I sustain them in this new season of their service. They were so sweet as to call me together after I lost Chris. I don't know how they heard about it. I didn't ask, but they had heard and had messaged me before with a text, but then they called because I guess they didn't realize that Chris had passed, or they thought it was another family member or something, but they bothered to call, and it was something that I recall with great gratitude and tenderness. They were so kind as to express their love and condolences and their sympathy to me and to my family. And anyway, wonderful people. We are blessed to have wonderful leaders in the church, and I thank God for our prophets, all of them, and for the spouses and family members that serve with them. And then we will also, of course, have a reorganization of the first pregnancy, and we will also have a new apostle. This is all happening pretty rapidly this time because we're right here up against General Conference, so the church moves forward. Well, the other thing I want to point out here was that if I was in a lesson at church that I thought was hard to listen to, you know, or separate reading that was kind of hard to listen to, I would try to memorize scriptures sometimes, and I'd bring a notebook or something, and I would write in the notebook, I'd write the verse that I wanted to memorize, and I would kind of then go back and write it again and organize the phrasing of it so that I could kind of visualize, well, this is said and then this, or this is said and then this, just to kind of create some structure to it so that it was a little easier to capture, in the memorization. And when I was writing this one out, I was starting with verse 25, and I wanted to do 26 and 27 as well. So I'm writing, upon my house shall it begin, and from my house shall it go forth. And then there's a saith the Lord. And then the next part I was writing, first among those among you, saith the Lord, who have professed to know my name and have not known me, and have blasphemed against me in the midst of my house, saith the Lord. Therefore, see to it that ye trouble not yourselves. And see to it, let's just notice that is never a suggestion. When God says see to it, it's not a suggestion. He's giving a direction here. Very firm, should be unequivocal. Therefore, see to it that ye trouble not yourselves concerning the affairs of my church in this place, saith the Lord. And what struck me was, I'm kind of putting these saith the Lords off to the side. And I thought, my goodness, I don't know if I've ever seen another little section of scripture, a few verses, not that many lines, where saith the Lord is used 4 times in relatively short order. So I went back and I looked at it again and I thought, why is he saying saith the Lord so often? And as I asked myself that question, the answer was right there. It was like, it's punctuation. Those were exclamation points. So try to read it now with exclamation points. Upon my house shall it begin, and from my house shall it go forth, saith the Lord! Exclamation point. First amongst those among you, saith the Lord. That's an interesting place for an exclamation point. First amongst those among you, saith the Lord, who have professed to know my name and have not known me. Those are the hypocrites, the Pharisees, and have blasphemed against me, because that's what that is. That's blasphemy, when you are pretending to be a representative of the Lord or a witness of Christ or whatever, but you're really just a hypocrite. First, have blasphemed against me in the midst of my house, saith the Lord. That's another punctuation mark, an exclamation point. Therefore, see to it, very strong language there, that ye trouble not yourselves concerning the affairs of my church in this place, saith the Lord. Now, what does that mean? That means stop thinking this is your problem. It's not your problem. It's the Lord's problem, and he's got it. It's already handled. He knows how he's going to deal with it, and it will be in the right way and the right time, and not before. So let it go. Let go and let God. It's not our job to clean up the church. It's his. And he will not falter. He will not fail. It will just happen in his timing, not in ours. So see to it that ye trouble not yourselves concerning the affairs of my church in this place. Like, not your business. That doesn't mean we can't be appropriately aware, especially when it touches us or whatever, or when we need to comfort somebody else or try to help them rescue their testimonies from what's going on. And I hope you'll come back to section 112 if necessary for friends or family members or for ourselves as we need comfort and realize that, like, the Lord has this. It's already in the plan that the time for the reaping of the tares will come. He's going to send his angels. They're going to bundle up the tares and burn them. That's what's going to happen. Now, the big thing that we can control is whether or not we're in that group of tares, or if we stay in the wheat, or move over to the wheat, or grow in the wheat. And that's what he says. Therefore, purify your hearts. In other words, tend your own garden. Stop worrying about the troubles of other people, but purify your hearts. And when you do see those troubles, use it as a reminder that, like, okay, do I have some hypocrisies? Do I have some weaknesses that I need to overcome? Am I living faithfully up to the covenants that I have made? Because that's what I can control. And if I'm trying to control everybody else, but I'm letting those things go untended in myself, then I'm going to lose out. Because this is the time for men to prepare to meet their God. This is the time for me to prepare to meet my God. Anyway, I love this at the end, verse 34. I come quickly. Yeah, relatively. And my reward is with me. Again, why do we forget that? He tells us this stuff up front. My reward is with me. Like, don't expect it to be right now. Right now is a day of tribulation, right? It's a day of refinement, a day of growth, of progress, of becoming, of opportunity to conform to the image of Christ. That's what's going on now. It's not the day of reward. My reward is with me when I come to recompense every man according to his work. I am Alpha and Omega. Amen. Anyway, beautiful words. I think people probably picked this up, but I'm just mentioning in section 113 when he's getting some questions answered about Isaiah, what the prophet is. He asks about who is the stem of Jesse, and the answer is Jesus Christ. But you remember that Jesse he's talking about is the father of King David, the shepherd boy who becomes the king, right? Jesse. So remember that Christ is a direct descendant of King David, and that means a direct descendant of Jesse. So when he talks about the stem of Jesse, that is Jesus Christ. When he talks about the root of Jesse, that's the descendant of Jesse as well as of Joseph. Now, he does mention that that's going to be a descendant, this is verse 4, a descendant of Jesse as well as of Ephraim. Now, bloodlines mix because Jesse, King David, and Christ are in the tribe of Judah, right? And Ephraim was the son of Joseph. So Judah and Joseph are brothers, 2 of the 12 tribes, although Joseph we've typically split into Ephraim and Manasseh, but they're both Joseph. And the root of Jesse will end up being somebody who is descendant of both the tribe of Ephraim and also the tribe of Judah. But again, as we've said, bloodlines mix. We're not going to worry about that too much. I just want to say one more thing. I say this a lot, and I mentioned this fairly recently again, that there's a lot of pain that people experience because we don't understand fully the workings of the Lord. And I know that that's part of the journey to sometimes struggle through, seeing through a glass darkly or having the veil in place so that we have to struggle to understand the workings of God. But please continue in that journey and hunger and thirst after the answers that you need, but trust the Lord in the interim. And I hope that we always default to trust rather than default to doubt. We're so impatient about those things, and we don't recognize how purifying it is to believe what we cannot see or what we don't fully understand. And we just reviewed Adam and Eve making that offering of the firstlings of the flock, most likely for decades. Like, it really sounds like they've been doing this ever since they left the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve are offering these sacrifices regularly for a long time before the angel comes, because they've already had all these children that have paired off and they're multiplying and replenishing, and they've even had children of their own. So they're grandparents. So how long had they been making that offering and not understanding exactly why? But they did it because the Lord commanded it, and they trusted him. They were willing to do what was right before understanding all the, the rest of the story, or all the meanings thereof, or, how this was really going to end up blessing them, other than just like, is it just a hoop to jump through? The Lord doesn't do that. He doesn't have us jump through hoops. It all is for our good. All of the commandments of the Lord are for us. They're blessings. That is a manifestation of his love for us, that he gives us this advance information in the commandments as to what things can lead us to ultimate joy and what things lead to sorrow. So, again, a lot of that is just about defaulting to trust and recognizing that, like Adam and Eve, the answers will come, and God tells us to seek the mysteries, but then to be patient and default to trust, default to faith, and understand what a blessing it is for us to be able to exercise our faith in the darkness of this world, in the valley of the shadow that we pass through, where we're struggling, we're in pain, we're in loss, and we don't really understand all the reasons for what's going on or why it had to be a certain way. But defaulting towards trust does something purifying to us. It is a part of the process of sanctification. We've talked about lots of quotes that tell us that really sanctification requires a measure of suffering. But during that suffering, can we default to trust? And honestly, that changes the quality of the suffering. If we believe, even though we may not understand all the intricacies and the details of the answer, but we believe that suffering that is not a result of our own sin, that's a different category of suffering. If I put my hand on a hot stove, I'm going to get burned. And I can't blame God for that or think that that's a sanctifying experience. I mean, Christ can make lemonade out of my lemons, but that doesn't mean it was a good thing that I put my hand on the hot stove. So if I can obey the commandments, I can miss out on a lot of those hot stoves. But when it's a suffering that comes because it's just suffering, being in this earth, subject to the troubles of this earth or the evil acts of others, but I didn't do it myself. I didn't do it out of my own rebellion. I didn't do something rebellious that inevitably leads to suffering. And when that happens, and I feel like I'm an innocent or relatively innocent, but going through the valley of the shadow, if I can trust that there's a purpose to that pain, it changes the way I experience it. And I am a witness of that, as many of you are as well. That trusting like that means that even though we may not know exactly the workings of the Lord in the moment, that there is a work going on that someday we will see and be grateful for. It seems like a big stretch sometimes, but let's stretch. Let's stretch into that, and we will suffer in a different way, and it will be a lesser suffering. As great as our suffering may be, it will not be the sorrowing of the damned. So anyway, taking this broader view of seeking, understanding is just such a better path. So I heard something about Julie Hanks, just I think it was this morning that I saw this little video about, and I don't remember what podcast she was on, but, she's left the church now and she's made that public announcement on her media, which, we don't rejoice in that. Like, I mean, it's sad when anybody turns their back on the kingdom of God and on their covenants. Like, that makes me sad. And I don't wish that on her. I don't wish that on her family or anybody else. But I guess she was on this podcast, and I was hearing this secondhand from Jacob Hansen, who does the Thoughtful Faith stuff. I hadn't heard him for a while, but anyway, I saw something where he was talking about her visit on another podcast, which was, for Exmos. So she's talking about losing your faith and all that kind of stuff. And the question was, do you have a time where you started to lose your faith, or you can pinpoint a time? And she said something interesting. She said, it was interesting to me. She said, yeah, it was when, and I don't remember the language she used, but she talked about this letter that came out that said that the church would no longer do baby blessings for babies of gay couples. And people went ballistic. And the church backed up on that one a little while later because they were just not wanting to have that fight. But to me, we maybe missed an opportunity during that time. I know there was a video that Elder Christofferson participated in that did a pretty good job of explaining more of that. But I think maybe we could have talked about it more, or maybe it was just one of those sifting trials. But we take such a shallow view. And honestly, I mean, she's not a stupid person, except that like sin eventually makes you stupid. But it's hard sometimes for me to think like, why don't people figure this out? It's not rocket science. I mean, they're looking at the surface and they're so reactive. Like, oh, God hates gay people, so he won't bless their children. Like it's retaliatory, like it's vengeful or mean. And I'm like, well, first of all, I come from a place where I'm like, God's not mean. Like, why do I think I'm nicer than God? Like, seriously, talk about hubris. Like, and you think you're nicer than God? I got news for you. Let's rethink that. I mean, I'm pretty sure. And again, I refer to this verse a lot, but I love it, where Christ is talking about the Father's love. And he says, which of you, if your child asks of you, what is it? Bread, will give him a stone, or asks fish and you give him a serpent. And then he says, if you being evil, and I think we can interpret that correctly to mean, if you being human, you being such imperfect people, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more do you think God knows how to give good gifts to his children? And we should review that, maybe 10 times a day until it sticks. That why do we think we're nicer than God? Where do we get off thinking that I'm nicer to gay people? I love gay people better than God does? I love anybody, black people, minority group. I mean, like, really? Really? You think you love anybody better than God does? Like, there's a lot of arrogance in that. I don't think we should go there. Anyway, I think that's what happened. Like, people just, went, like I said, kind of like ballistic about, oh, now, church is going to be so mean and not give a baby blessing to these little kids. Well, what happens when a baby is blessed in the church? They go on the records. They are now a child of record. And that means they're going to show up on all the primary roles from now till forever. Now, think long view here. God's always playing the long game. So, like, does that gay family really benefit from having, calls almost every year, or who knows, from the primary president or the new teacher saying, oh, is little Johnny or Susie going to come to class? We'd like him to come. And, come and participate in primary, where we're going to end up talking about families, eternal families, which are a husband and a wife and children. And your kid is gonna be kinda stuck there, go, "Well, I have 2 moms or 2 dads," and, like, that's not anyway, whatever. Like, is that really what you want? You really want your child to be a member of record in a church that is gonna teach him that his parents are out in left field. Not in a mean way, but just as we teach the doctrines of the kingdom, that's gonna come up. Is that what you really want? And notice how the church has taken this very consistent policy with the children of polygamist families. Same thing. Like, why would we? And to the point where, like, if a kid who comes from a polygamous family, met the missionaries or wanted to be baptized or whatever, the church would say, not till you're 18. Because we need you to be independent, not dependent on your parents, not coming to a church where we're going to teach you that your parents are involved in incorrect practices concerning marriage that cannot be sanctioned by the heavens, that are not sanctioned by the heavens. So it was the same playbook, that it was very consistent. And what's so ironic, and I said this at the time, like, they've accused us of being a cult forever. Well, what do cults do? They take kids away from their parents and brainwash them that their parents are evil. So here the church was reaffirming its consistent policy that we don't take children from their homes and try to tell them that their parents are evil. And now they're accusing us of being nasty. Like, we can't win for losing. Either we're a cult or now we're just mean because we won't put these kids on the church record. So then the church is like, fine. Of course, it's going to mess up the paperwork and it's going to be kind of a pain in the neck and it's not going to do any better. It's not going to help your kid any more than not, because you really think if that baby didn't get blessed in church, you think the Lord's not mindful of that baby? Again, you think you're more kind toward that baby than God the Father is? That God won't be mindful of all those children of polygamous families and all those kids of gay couples, as well as their parents, whatever. Like, God is going to forget his children, but you're not. You're nicer than he. Again, don't go there. Brothers and sisters, can we just not stay on the surface? Again, what are we talking about here? Critical thinking. Just a little critical thinking, please. Well, I guess, Sister Hanks didn't go there. And so she got bent out of shape. And as she even said, apparently, and they showed a clip of this where she said, that's where I knew that, like, something like that wasn't Jesus, or, Jesus Christ wasn't in that. And I'm like, yeah, he was. Yeah, he was. But people can't handle it. And people in the church were upset about it too, like her and others. And so God says, okay, and this is back to section 58. I command and men obey not. I revoke and they receive not the blessing. Fine, we'll leave you more in the dark, but you're missing out on understanding how good the Father is and how his works are always the long game. Nobody is going to miss out on the opportunity to receive the gospel of Jesus Christ in its entirety. Every person on the planet, of course, the innocent children in whatever family dynamic they grow up in, are going to be given that full opportunity when the time is right. So nobody misses out on anything who's innocent, and all of them will get a chance. All of us get a chance. Does that make sense? I just think it's so important to default toward trust. Default towards faith. Don't default towards doubt. Again, what do we understand about God? And how much do we let ourselves be too, overly limited in our understanding of him? And then it wrenches our heartstrings unnecessarily, not in the way that Joseph Smith was saying was necessary for celestial glory and exaltation, but in a way that just burns us into ash instead of refines us into gold. I love you, brothers and sisters. Let's trust him always, forever, to greater and greater degrees, and with every fiber of our being, to the depths of our soul. Let's trust and rejoice in God the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, and what they offer us in an opportunity to choose celestial glory and build Zion. As ever, my thanks to my amazing husband, Chris Anderson, and Doug Larson of Point Digital. Take care.